Today we're going to talk about the things that we think about. And so I'm going to ask you if you've got a piece of paper and pencil to get that out, because I want you to write some things down that are on your mind, and I'm going to make it really difficult for you in this regard. I want to read from the book of Philippians. Here the Apostle Paul is talking to the church at Philippi. And what we know about Philippi, of course, it was one of the Roman colonies. It was a city that didn't have to pay Roman taxes. It was a city that was gold mining. It was a city established by Philip, Alexander the Great's father. And what we know about Philippi in terms of a church, it was evidently the most giving, caring church. And the Apostle Paul loved the people there in Philippi. And he writes this letter from prison, probably in Rome. He sends back Epaphroditus to be with the people he'd been sent to Paul to be his servant. Even in his captivity, that was allowed. But he got sick, and Paul, because of his concern for him, again, looking out for the benefit of others, because it is amazing today. I cannot believe how all these things have tied in. For example, my wife had no idea what the sermon was about today. And yet what she had to say, what she read there, the songs that we sang and what Jeanette also sang tie in absolutely perfectly. So when we read there in Philippians chapter 2, he says, talking about let this mind be in us that is in Christ Jesus. He's talking about looking out for the cares and concerns of others, have tender compassion, and to make his joy complete by being like-minded. And there's nothing like having a family, a group, and everybody's they're on the same page. I mean, we're all different, but you're on the same page and being like-minded and one spirit and purpose and doing nothing out of selfish ambition, which, again, tied in with Karen was reading for us today. So, having made these comments, I want to read from Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 and 9. And it's going to give you answers here to the questions I'm going to ask. But in verse 8, the Apostle Paul is telling the church here, in verse 8, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. So your little assignment as we march through this sermon today is I want you to write down those words. That is true, that, what is noble or honorable, what is pure, lovely, admirable, and then I want you to write things that fit that category. And I'll tell you why as we move on through here. Now, when we think about what we think, and Paul is saying, think on these things. This is his admonition to the church there. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, where is our mind? And what are we thinking? And when we get ourselves in trouble, and we often do, we ask ourselves this question, and I assume that many of you, like myself, have asked myself this question: what in the world was I thinking? And usually when I'm asking that question, I have done something wrong, I have made a mistake, I haven't considered things and the like, so what was I thinking? So the Apostle Paul is telling them to actually do something. It's an activity, it's a responsibility. He says, think on these things. Now, putting aside time to think has been called meditation. You can use that from the Old Testament example of people meditating, thinking on something. But the question for us today is, do we put aside time for thinking? And if we do, what are we thinking about? In our world today, many of us, our thoughts are anxious. Our thoughts can be obsessive. Our thoughts can be negative. Our thoughts can be mischievous, if not evil, from time to time, the things that we're thinking. But he's saying to put aside time and to think on these particular things. Because thinking has a powerful impact on who we are and how we live. So when Paul gives us instruction to the church of Philippi about what to think on, we can kind of be reminded of a proverb, and I want to read this because thinking has an incredible impact on our heart, our mind, and our lives and our actions. So in Proverbs 23 and verse 7, it's talking about, first of all, about an evil man. And it's something about being evil that it is a kind of a constant. You're always thinking of ways of doing bad things, evil people. But in this verse it says, he's talking about a stingy man, all that in verse 6. He says, for he is the kind of man who is always thinking about the cost. Or in another word, he is thinking about the evil, is the way the King James Version puts it. It says, eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. And it translates more in the King James Version, the thinking of as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So the famous philosopher René Descartes, from I think it's about 1596 to 16 something, had to say, I think, therefore I am. And well, when you think about that, I think, therefore I am. So what was he thinking and how was he thinking? He was talking about the fact that much of what we think is not real. We project out there just because we see a person walking down the street. It's got a coat on. We make an assumption that it's a person and all of that, but it may be a dream. It may not be true. It's negative, and just like we have dreams, or Dave was talking about his dream, he wakes up and realizes, well, that's not true. That's not a reality. That was kind of his everyday awake thinking, and then in essence, it's perception, but there's no truth in it. Not real truth. What we find is what we think in our mind, that is the best that kind of we can have. So it's a perceived world in doubt of any truth. Now, when we think about what we are thinking and why we would want to do what the Apostle Paul says, I want us to be reminded of what Jesus said in terms of what we think and how we think, because we can tend to think that our thoughts are our own. And what difference does that make? Because I can think what I want to think and the like. But Jesus, in this case where he had healed an individual, he says to them, this is Matthew 9 and verse 4, knowing their thoughts. Now, in our ability, we're actually, to a degree, we can perceive that somebody doesn't agree with us, by body movement, by eye movement, body language, etc. Or lack of saying anything. When you say to your spouse, well, I think this would be a good idea, and there's no response, you begin to think, now, do they not like this idea? And we begin to search and see what we're trying to understand what they think. But Jesus said, knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, why do you entertain evil thoughts in your heart? So we have the capacity to entertain both good and evil thoughts within our hearts and minds. And of course, the Apostle Paul addressed that issue in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 5, not in your notes, but he says, casting down vain imaginations and everything that exalts itself against God.
The world today is a challenging environment for Christian believers and followers of Jesus Christ. Looking for answers? Grace Communion International local churches in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto offers a comforting environment for Christians in search of spiritual growth and development. Contact our local ministry. Attend our local GCI churches at the times listed on your screen.